Okay. Maybe some more people will join as we start to move on. But I think we got a lot to cover, so I might go ahead and get started. This is the Apostrophe and Docker workshop. Today we're going to cover some basic overview of what Apostrophe is, how you might use it, and what Docker is, and how you might also work with that as well. So my name is Greg Van Brug. I'm a senior software engineer with Apostrophe Technologies. I work on the success team there. So my primary role is to help our enterprise clients develop and deploy Apostrophe websites. Prior to joining Apostrophe, I had done a lot of work in single page applications. Also worked with some other CMSs like WordPress and Drupal. And even built some like static sites. With all of those though, the underlying thing that was kind of similar was we all had used Docker to deploy them. And I'll kind of cover a little bit of what that means in a minute. I have some contact information on here if you want to reach out to me. My email address, this is all in the handout that's attached to. And if you want to reach me anywhere on social, my primary handle is @GregVanBrug. So what we're going to cover today, first thing is we'll just give a general overview to Docker, what that is, and kind of the primary components of it. We'll go through building and running a Docker image, and then we'll do an overview of Apostrophe and how you might Dockerize Apostrophe to deploy it to your server. Some minimum requirements for today. I'm assuming most of you here, or the one that's here, is a developer, so you probably already have Git installed on your machine. Node 8+, I will kind of caveat that with the Apostrophe. This is primarily for the Apostrophe part of the workshop. So if you want to follow along with that, make sure you have Node 8+ on there. Our documentation does say Node 4 or better, but you probably should be running at least 8 or better. And just kind of for context, I'm on 12. MongoDB at least 2.6. Again, that's kind of like the minimum requirement from our documentation, but I primarily run 4.2 and Docker at least 1.13.0. And just for a little more context on that, I'm on 1903.8. That sounds like a big jump from 1, but this number actually had jumped from 1 to I think about 16 about 2 years ago. So if you're on 1, you're probably pretty old. And then lastly, there is a GitHub repository where I have some sample code that we'll use for the examples we'll go through. And you can use that as a starting point for doing some work. So what is Docker? Docker is an open source platform for developing, shipping, and running applications. In my opinion, that's kind of like a terrible definition because it doesn't really give any kind of context to how it does that. What it actually does is provides the ability to package and run an application in loosely isolated environments called a container. And what's nice about this is it starts to allow you to take away the infrastructure kind of issues that you might have and allow you to focus on debugging your app and not your individual environment. Docker is a little bit different from Vagrant in a sense that what it uses is the host machine's kernel. So this allows the Docker containers to be much smaller than a typical Vagrant virtual machine that actually creates its own kernel and ends up being a lot larger in size. And then lastly, Docker's been around since about 2013. So it is pretty mature at this point. And a lot of large enterprise solutions do use Docker to deploy their applications. The 3 main parts to this are the server, the client, and the registry. So if you install Docker, you'll have a Docker server running on your machine. This is the Docker desktop application. If you install this, the server is also installed on your machine. And if you wanted to really get into the weeds and you were checking your processes running on your machine, This is the docker d command that's running in the background. The next part to this is the CLI, and that's the actual Docker command. Docker actually does come shipped with another command, another CLI tool that we'll kind of go over a little bit later, but this is the primary Docker CLI command. And then the third piece is the Docker registry, and this is where all of the primary Docker base images live. You can kind of create an image for anything. I mean, if you post it up to here, it's kind of like an NPM or a GitHub for Docker images that you can start to use in your own projects. So the basic Docker objects that you're going to be interacting with are images, containers, volumes, networks, and services. And just to quickly define these 5 things, an image in its base part is a set of instructions for how an application should run. An image should be reproducible, and this is kind of like what your containers will be based on. One note about these, you can kind of use the official images straight out of the box if you want. You can also create your own images to your own needs for your individual application, which leads into containers. So a container is basically just an instance of an image. These are designed to be self-contained, isolated, and in many cases should be considered disposable. So what that means is that if you just delete your container, you should be able to recreate a new one based on your image that basically loosely is identical to the one that you just threw away. That's kind of the beauty of Docker itself, that these things are, hello? Okay.
Hey, Greg, I just want to let you know I don't see your slides switching, even though I'm just running through like the PDF as you talk.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's weird. Do you see the current Docker object slide right now?
No, so what I see is your rainbow like first deck slide.
Oh, weird. I actually have paused my screen. There we go.
Okay, I see it now. Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so containers are basically just an instance of an image. And then that brings us to volume. So volume is a directory or amount to share or persist data between individual containers. That's kind of how you can share things between them. And then a network is a grouping of shared connected containers or services. And then a service is one or more of these containers working together. So, whoops. If you haven't already, we have an opportunity now to install Docker and just verify that it's running. So if you go to this URL here, this is also in the PDF, it should be clickable. That should open up the GitHub repo that has some basic instructions on there. So I'm going to switch over to that now. So you should be able to see a GitHub page here. I'll make it a little bit bigger and get rid of my email. So if you haven't already installed Docker, it's available here. You can choose the individual download for your environment. Download Docker. And then you should be able to run through the installer. This should be a pretty simple drag and drop. Get rid of my other screen. So I already have it installed, but if you drag that to your the right directory, that should install it. And then once that is installed, make sure this is running. You should get this little like whale Docker icon up here. And that actually is the Docker desktop application. You should see that it's running. And just a real walkthrough of the dashboard real quick. Other screen. If you had a container running, it would show here. You have some basic settings here. But just to verify that it's running in your terminal, which we'll be using a little bit later, if you're in a terminal window and you just type Docker, you should see the manual page for that. And that should signify that Docker has been installed correctly. Okay. So I'm going to jump back to the presentation now. And then the next thing we're going to run through is building and running a Docker image. So the way that you would do that is through a Docker file. And this is a very basic one right here. This is actually the minimal instructions, pretty minimal instructions that you need to start one. So the first command, the from, that's going to pick our base image, which in this case is Node version 12. We're going to copy some files from our project into a directory in the container. And then we're going to run the command, the node command on that file to start our container. So that's a basic one. Context for these can kind of vary from Docker file to Docker file. So you might want to double check the base images that you're pulling things from. I try to stick to the official images, and by that I mean the from command up here. Typically you want that to be an official image that you're pulling from, not just someone that someone has developed on their own. And those are all listed out and searchable through the registry itself. Some Docker commands, Docker file commands that you might use. This is actually all of them, but for our purposes today, we're going to focus on these 6. So like I mentioned before, the from commands, this defines the base image to be used. It's typically like a database, a scripting language, or another kind of server. Your work dir, that's basically just your working directory where you're going to run commands from or copy files to. It's kind of just a shortcut instead of having to hard code the path to all that stuff every single time. The copy command, and that allows you to take files from your source and copy it to the container's file system at a set destination. You might be wondering like kind of what the difference between copy and add are, and it's very minimal, but add does allow you to do some things like include a tarball from somewhere else, where you might want to like unpack it in the container instead of having to copy all the files directly. The run command, that allows you to do executables within the container itself. So if you're going to like npm install or apt-get something, the run command is what allows you to do that. Expose is how you expose the ports from the container to the host. Kind of go through that in a minute. And then the cmd command is what is the primary command for the container itself. So that's what will run when the container starts up. So building an image. Basically to do that, you're gonna run the Docker command on the image build, with the dot being the context for where it's going to build the image from. Dot is just your current directory. And then I'm gonna tag it as my image version 1.0. After you've done that, you should have an image that you could start to run. So you could use the Docker container run commands with some additional arguments here, publish, which is taking the host 8000 and mapping it to the container's internal 8080 port. I'm going to run it in detach mode, which means basically just that all the commands that the container is running are going to happen in the background, so you don't see a huge log of those things. And then name is just giving it the name image, and that's going to map to use the my image version 1.0 as the image that you're going to base this container off. So some common Docker CLI commands. This is there's a lot more than these, but we're going to kind of focus on these ones today. So the build command, which I just kind of showed, that's how you build an image from a Docker file. Run is how you create the container and start it. It's basically doing like a build and a start. PS will allow you to list all the containers that are running on your machine. And stop is how you stop a container. Another one that we are probably going to use a little bit later is the exec command, which is grayed out here. But that allows you to execute a command within a running container. So for example, you wanted to basically like SSH into the container to see what was there, or additionally run another command like switching a user or something. So for this next to do, what we're going to do is create a Docker image that runs an Express server. If you haven't worked with Express before, that's okay. I have an example for you within this repository. So for this one, we're going to jump back to our terminal. I'm already within this repository, but here is the README. So just kind of like quickly what's in here. Oops, this is the answer. So in this repository, if you haven't noticed already, there are two branches, a master and examples. If you get stuck or have an issue, you should be able to jump over to the examples branch, and there's a working example there. If you want to do it the hard way and try and run through the README, all the instructions on how to do the example are here. So we're going to start by building our first Docker image. So I'm going to pull this to the side. I'm going to pull out my editor. Looks like I'm in the wrong thing. Here we go. Okay, so for the second to do, what we're going to do is create a Docker image to create a container for this Express app that we've done here. And all this really does is requires the Express application, creates a new instance of it. It exposes it on port 3000. And then if we get send a GET request to our browser, it should print hello world in our browser. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a Docker file. And my thing crashed. Sorry about that. Hopefully this text is large enough, but I'll bump it up a little bit. So the first thing we're going to do is create the choose the image that we're going to create our container from. So our app is an Express app, which uses Node. So we're going to start with our Node image. The next thing we're going to do is tell it where to put our file. So we have this app.js file. And if you're familiar with working with Node or JavaScript, you might have a package.json file that it has all your dependencies. This one obviously is just Express. So what we're going to do here is make sure that we have our working directory that we're going to copy those files into. So we're going to use the workdir commands and set it to user source app. And that's just a directory within this Node container that I'm going to copy the things to. The next thing we're going to do is add our dependencies to this container. And the way we do that is through the copy command. And the first thing I'm going to copy is the package.json file, which includes the Express dependency. And I'm going to put it in the root of this app directory. What we'll do next, if you're familiar with working with Node, you're probably going to want to be able to install the dependencies. So we're going to run npm install. And this command is available because we are using Node as the base image. The next thing we're going to do is copy in our application. And because our app exposes port 3000, we're also going to want to make sure our container can do that so our browser can talk to it. And then lastly, we're going to start our container using the command. So we're going to run node, which is available from our node image, and we're going to point it to our app.js file. Now that we have our base image defined, we're going to build it and start to run this container. So from this O2 directory, right now I'm just in the root, so I'm going to make sure I get in there. Whoops. We're going to run the docker image build command, like shown earlier. So docker image build, my Docker file is in the root of the directory I'm in, so I can use that as the context. I'm going to tag this as my express image 0.1. It's going to run through the build command, and we've successfully created our first image. The next thing we're going to do is create a container based off this image. So I'm going to use the docker container run command. I want to make sure that it's exposing my port. So I'm going to make sure it publishes the 3000 port to my host. I'm going to run it in detach mode so I don't have to look at the log. And I'm going to give it a name. And lastly, we're going to pick that express image that we just created. So hopefully now we should have a Docker container running with this hash applied to it. So if I open my browser, see if I can get on. and I point it to localhost 3000. I now have my Express app running in my container, and I'm accessing it from my browser. Another way that you can check to make sure that it's running, if you go to the dashboard here, everything keeps opening on my other window. You can see the container that I just created. It'll be green and say running here. And if you ever like run into an issue where you're creating an image and it doesn't work, a good way to start to debug that is looking through the logs here. Typically, that will give you an idea of where things may have gone wrong that you can use to start to debug your image. Now that we've done this, I'm going to stop this container. I think. And remove it. So now if I try and hit 3000, I should get an empty page. Okay. Hopefully everyone is still with me. The next thing we're going to start to cover is Apostrophe and how you might use this to start to build websites. So Apostrophe is an open source enterprise level CMS. It's powered by Node. It stores data with MongoDB. It uses the Express web framework and uses Nunjux to render pages. Some of the main features of Apostrophe are it has in-context editing with drag and drop reordering. I know if you've used newer versions of WordPress with Gutenberg, it's kind of similar to this, but we were doing it way before. There's also a built-in image and file library and extensible content pieces called content types called pieces in Apostrophe. It's also completely customizable. So if you don't like the way that something functions, you do have the ability to enhance or overwrite any piece of Apostrophe you want. It's been around since 2008, but it's been running on Node since about 2016. It also powers all kinds of websites from community organizations to larger universities, startups, and some national and international companies. The primary things in Apostrophe that you'll be interacting with and the way to add content is through pieces, pages, and widgets. Pieces are basically content types. They are collections of content. If you're familiar with like posts in a WordPress or I guess pieces in Drupal, similar content, similar concept. They also have index and detail pages kind of out of the box. Pages probably are pretty self-explanatory. They're individual pages. You can add like managed pages, like where you have editable areas, or you could even add a static parked page if you really wanted to. Pages are hierarchical and can be managed as a tree. And then widgets are basically just areas to add inline editable regions to pieces or pages. I'll kind of cover that a little bit later when we get into that a little bit. And if you want to look at the documentation, that's a good starting point for Apostrophe CMS docs. So Apostrophe modules. The basic architecture of Apostrophe is it's comprised of modules, and at a very base level, this is really all you need. If you're familiar with JavaScript development, Apostrophe modules will probably be pretty familiar. If not, the basic concept behind a module, though, is it's just a self-contained grouping of specific functionality. Every module minimally has this index.js file, which can extend, enhance, or overwrite another Apostrophe module. I'll kind of get into what that means a little bit later, but that's kind of what allows Apostrophe to be fully customizable, is this module extension enhancement or ability to overwrite. A basic module looks something similar to this. At the very base, you're going to extend something. In this case, it's just a default module, but you could be extending apostrophe pieces, apostrophe pages, any other apostrophe module that you have installed. We also have the construct pattern where you can add additional functionality to your module. You could configure options in this like first ... area. Those will kind of vary based on the individual module that you have installed. But again, if you're familiar with kind of common JavaScript development, that should look pretty similar. And then in this construct, you might do something like extend the functionality of the module itself, expose API route, or push assets to Apostrophe's build system. All the modules in your project are registered in the app.js file, which is the main entry point for Apostrophe. Again, if you're familiar with Node-based or JavaScript development, this probably looks pretty familiar. You're just requiring a module and then setting some options to it. Minimally in the app.js, you'll have something like a base URL and your site name, and then basic configuration for your modules. Here's the one that I just created. I'm going to register it here. One thing you notice here too is some things can be configured here. You could do all your configuration here if you really wanted to. But typically, in my experience, what I've done is only things that are needing to be configured and don't have supporting files, get out all the configuration here. If not, you might want to put it in the individual module itself. I'll skipping back. That might mean that you have your configuration here instead of in the app.js. Hopefully that makes sense. So going back to our module, this example here is probably not very common. So let's look at something that might be a little bit more common. So in this pattern, this is kind of like a standard apostrophe module. You don't have to stick to this structure, but some of the folders and files here might be quote unquote special, meaning that if they are named a certain way or placed in a certain spot, Apostrophe is going to pick them up automatically for you. If not, you might have to manually load them yourself. So what that means is we'll go to our lib directory. This is somewhere that might have some backend functionality that you want to add. If I were to use a module that had a file called API.js, I could basically overwrite that here on my project level module level. Lib is typically where you'll add backend functionality. There's nothing super special about this directory. It's just a common pattern where you'd add additional functionality here. Public, this is basically a spot to put all your front-end assets. Again, some of the files and folders here are kind of special. Kind of depends on the module again, but if you are overwriting something, you might take a copy of the root module and then add your specific functionality on top of it here. Some things like always anon and user are special file names. That means that like it might depend on when these files are loaded, meaning I always want this file to load. I want this file to load when I have an anonymous user visiting the site, or I have this file and I want it to be loaded when a user's logged in. You don't necessarily have to use these file names. You can configure it yourself and tell Apostrophe when to load those files. Maybe we'll get into that later, but it might be a little bit confusing. And then the views folder. This is sort of special in a way that, in a sense that Apostrophe will automatically load any HTML file that is placed within this directory. What you're seeing here probably is not super common in a sense that these index and show files are coming probably from Apostrophe pieces. And this widget one would be in a widget definition. So you probably wouldn't see all three of these files ever together, but these are common files that you might see throughout Apostrophe modules. Hopefully that's not confusing. The most important thing to understand about modules, though, is if you're extending something and you overwrite the root module file, you can customize or overwrite basically any aspect of a given module. And that applies to the front end as well as the back end. So for example, if I had a custom login screen, I could take the login file from the Apostrophe root module and customize it in my project at the project level without having to touch any of the backend functionality. Or if I didn't like how it worked, I could extend the login functionality locally in my projects. Schemas are the next big important thing to understand about Apostrophe. And all this really is an array of objects that help define the fields that will exist for a particular kind of object. Schemas are extremely powerful. They don't just power the database, but they also generate the admin UI interfaces for creating and editing content in Apostrophe. It comes with a lot of built-in schema types. In this case, I just have a string, but other very common ones are areas, arrays, Boolean values, checkboxes, date, email, any kind of join if you wanted to get two types of pieces together, select for options, a singleton. We'll kind of go over what singletons and areas mean in a minute, a URL, and a video. You can also add images through areas or singletons, so I didn't want to make sure that you forgot about those. So if I have a basic example like this, I'm just creating a name for my field. I'm adding a label, I'm telling it what type it is, and I'm adding some general help text for the editor so that they know how this field is going to be applied. With this base configuration, what I should get in the admin is something very similar to this. That's already defining these UI fields for me, and it's also creating the backend fields in the database for me at the same time. And then to display that content, this should probably look very familiar. This is just a nunjux template, and you can use dot notation to actually access that field that I just added in. The next thing that we'll cover are widgets, singletons, and areas. These are kind of broken out from pieces and pages in that these are individual areas of a particular page or template that you might add editing capabilities to. The main difference between a singleton and an area is a singleton allows you to place one widget in a spot versus an area where you could configure multiple. We'll kind of see a visual example of this in a minute, but just one thing to know that is basically the main difference between a singleton and an area. Out of the box, Apostrophe does come with standard widgets. These are for common things like images, texts, and attachments. We'll use some of these later in the to-do exercise that we're going to do after this section of the talk. So what this looks like at a code level, here is just a singleton that I'm going to add to my template itself. It's going to use the apos nunjux template helper, calling a singleton. This data.page is where I'm going to save the data to, the name of the area that I'm going to add it in, and the individual widget that I'm going to stick in that area with optionally some additional configuration. So in this case, I'm going to add a rich text editable area with my CK editor toolbar set to just bold and italic. And if I am logged into my site and I go to edit that field, I should get something that looks very similar to this. Alternatively, if you're going to use an area, very similar to what we just did in singleton, the only difference here is we're going to call an area and we're going to define two widgets to go in this area instead of one. Again, we're going to use the rich text editor. I'm also going to allow the user to add an image here. and I'm going to add some additional configuration for what those images do. Very similar again, I'm going to tell it where I'm going to send the object I'm going to save my data to, the area where it's going to go, and my widget definition. So changing that area in my template should now give me something like this, where the editor has the ability to select either of these items that they want to add to that area and visually rearrange them on the screen. The next thing we're going to cover a little bit is the Apostrophe CLI. This is a tool that allows you to quickly scaffold your project or pieces of it. I will say the most commonly used part of this is probably just the, is the create project command and to initialize and create the admin user for first time login. You can install it globally. Alternatively, if you don't want to install a global, you can also use the npx command. If you don't know about this, this has been around since 5.2 in Node, and it allows you to run executables without installing them globally. But for the sake of this example, we'll just assume that they are installed globally. So how you would create a new Apostrophe project using the CLI, you would just run the Apostrophe command with the create project function, and you're going to give your site a name. In this case, my site. The next thing we'll do is install the dependencies. So we'll go into that new directory that we just created and install them. And then we'll add the admin user using the node command. So this is just going to run the Apostrophe users command with the add argument. And I'm going to add an admin user to the admin group. Once this runs, you'll be prompted to add a password that you'll set for the default admin user. And then lastly, you should be able to run npm start to get your project running. And if everything went well, you should see a bare bones Apostrophe website. If you log in, you'll see the Apostrophe toolbar up here with the basic configuration. This is editable. You could change the way that this looks and feel, but default installation will give you access to manage your tags, the global document editor where you could manage things that might be like a site name or other kind of global options, a page manager, user management, image and file management, and then just a logout. To extend Apostrophe, our site has a brief list of kind of featured modules that are probably most common to most Apostrophe installs. This also includes like headless things to create and run a blog, Apostrophe events, and a very common one, workflow, which adds the ability to create draft and published versions of content. You can also look for Apostrophe modules on npm.js using the ApostropheCMS tag. All official modules are prefixed with apostrophe dash. So if you don't see that, that's something that's not built by us, but there are a lot of them out there. So the next thing we're going to do is create a default Apostrophe site using the CLI. We'll add a widget to the homepage, and then we'll create a talks piece. For this, I would recommend using the repository if you're not already. So what I'm going to do first is go into the 03, I think is the section we're on, yep. 03 directory. Do that here too. So the first thing that we're going to do is, if you haven't already, you can install the Apostrophe CLI. I have it installed on my machine already, but I'll give you a second to do that. Once that's installed, you should have access to the apostrophe command. And we're going to use the create project command. Oops. So I'm in the O3 directory, and I'm going to run it here. I'm going to call my site my site. So now we have a new my site in my directory. Oops. I'm going to cd into that my site that I just created. I'm going to install the dependencies. And now I can add the admin user. So I'm going to run the node command on app.js, use apostrophe users, add, and then admin in the admin group. I did that wrong. I think I spelled something wrong. So now it's asking me to add a password for the admin user that I just created. This will probably error out on me because I've already added a user. But you shouldn't see this error if you already have a user. And then I'm going to start my site. So now we should have an apostrophe site running on 3000. So if I go to my browser again, go to port 3000, I now see a very generic apostrophe project. I can log in, make this a little bit smaller, as the admin user that I just created. Oops. And you can see our global menu here. I'll kind of walk through the UI a little bit. So under tags, we have a tag manager. You can add new ones as you see fit. Adding a plus. These are not hierarchical, but you can add as many tags as you want. Under global, there isn't anything here yet. Under pages, we'll get to this in a second. But I have some page settings, general title, the type of page that it is, any tags that I want to add to this page, some general permissions so I can hide certain pages and force someone to log in to see them or only allow certain people to view them. I can lock down who can edit what or what group can edit things and whether or not these permissions should apply to just this page or all pages below it. Basic user management. So first name, last name, password, email. I can assign a user to a group. We can also disable their login if we need to. An image gallery where you can edit or manage your images. Can add a title, any type of basic information to it. This is all out of the box, so you can add a description, a credit, type of camera when it was taken. And then basic file management. And this is very similar to the image manager that we just went through. Some basic description, credit text, any of that for your files. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is add a rich text widget to the home page so we can allow a user to save content to that home page. We're going to use a singleton. So real quick before we do this, I probably should walk through the directory structure a little bit. Jump over to my project again. See if I can make this a little bit bigger for you. Hopefully this is a little bit easier to see. This guy. So in our new Apostrophe project, this is all the files that have been created through the boilerplate. I'm going to skip over some of these development and scripts folders, but the heart of the Apostrophe application is in this lib modules directory. And these are the basic ones that I have installed out of the box. So I have my Apostrophe assets, some database settings, the Express server, some page settings, some templates, and some users. Also, some base views here. So most pages are set under these templates here. So our home page template was under Apostrophe pages, views, pages, home. And this is the base HTML page that we're seeing in our browser now. So to add a rich text area to this rich text singleton to this screen, I'm going to edit this home template, and I'm going to remove this text here and replace it with the singleton. So to do that, I'm going to delete this guy. I'm going to use the apos helper. I want to save this to the page, so I'm going to use data.page. I'm going to call this area content, and then I'm going to fill it with my Apostrophe rich text widget. If I save that and reload my site, I have an error. Okay, I copied this wrong. Oops. Let's try that again. I now have an editable area on this page. I can bold this text. I could also add additional styles here if I wanted, but this is the basic stuff that I'm just going to stick in here for now. The next thing we're going to do is create a custom piece type that we'll call talks. We can use the CLI to do this. So I can create a piece type talk. I'm going to pass this last argument to it of pages, and that's going to do two things. It's going to create my talks piece, and it will also create the accompanying talks pages. We'll see what that looks like in a second. Get rid of this error. So I'm going to stop my project for a second to add these new things. So now I should now have a new piece and a new pieces pages. The next thing we're going to do is make sure that we register those two things in our app.js. Here's our two new directories that we created. The way we do that is through the app.js in our modules object. We're going to register them here. I'm just going to pass an empty object here. And that will let Apostrophe know about my new error. My new pieces and pages. So let's add some fields. Each of these talks is going to have a title, a time, an image, and content. And the way that we can add that is through the talks piece in the index.js. We'll have an add fields array where we're going to add our new fields. So within this add fields, I'm going to add first my time. Out of the box, we're going to get a title, so I'm going to ignore that one. The name is what will get used in the database to store this particular piece of content. So this is time. The label is going to be what displays in the admin UI. The type of field that I want, in this case, I'm just going to use a regular text, a string field, which is just a plain text field. And I'm going to add some help text so the admin knows what this field is for. And then with my project running, I have a typo. With that new piece type registered, I'll now have a talks piece in my admin bar. And if I go check out my new piece type, I can add a new talk. And I have now a field of my time that I just created. So I'm going to add the rest of the fields here. The next one we'll add is an image. I'm going to copy this to make sure I don't make a typo again. So again, I'm going to name my field image. I'm going to give it a label for the admin UI. In this case, we're going to use a singleton type, and that's going to allow us to use the apostrophe images widget, which will allow them to add an image to this field. And we're going to add some help text. So this is just the overview image for the talk. And for this widget, I'm going to add a limit of 1 to make sure that only 1 image can be uploaded in this field. The next thing that we'll add, this looks pretty crazy, but I'm going to add a content area to this as a next field for this section of the screen. So just to go over this real quick before we add it to our code. Again, we're going to add a name for our field. It's just the database key. The label that's going to be used. In this case, we're going to use an area instead of a singleton. It will make a difference in the UI, so I'll show you that in a second. And for this particular area, we're going to add 2 widgets. Again, the apostrophe rich text. We're going to configure our toolbar a little bit more with a little bit more options so they can add additional formatting in this area. We're also going to give it some heading styles that are specific to this area. So I'll allow them to put an H2 here or an H3. And again, I'll allow them to upload an image so they could have an in-context image for this area. Just to make sure I don't make a typo, I'm going to copy this again. And we're going to add this to our configuration. If we now refresh and go back to our talk, might have to restart the server. We now have additional fields for adding the image, which pulled from the media browser or the image browser. And we have this field for adding content. And I have both these rich text and file options. So I could add like a PDF or something to this area as well. So I'm going to create a new talk here. We'll add some basic details to here. I'm going to add an image. We'll create a new one. So I'm going to add the apostrophe logo. I'm going to save it. I'm going to make this my choice for the area. And then I'm going to add some content here. So the first thing, I'll just add some general text. I'm going to cheat and grab some lipsum. I'm also going to attach a file that I'm going to allow people to download. Here, when I'm adding a file attachment, I have the ability to choose how I want to do it. This could be on an individual file level. I could also choose it by tag, and I can choose how many attachments to be displayed at once. In this case, I want to manually pick it, so I'm going to choose individually. I'm going to pick a new file off my machine. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to make this my choice for the area. I had one already. So now I have a new talk. One thing that catches people every once in a while is sometimes it's not always published by default. So if you add a new piece, just make sure that publish is set to yes in order for it to show up on your page, on your site. So the next part we're going to go through is how we actually display those on our site. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is configure our talks pages so that we have templates to edit. Just looking at our configuration out of the box, we're extending Apostrophe pieces pages. It has a basic label attached to it. I could add more fields here if I want to, but I've already done that in my piece, so I don't need to. One thing I do need to do is give it a name so I can register my pages. So I'm going to grab my name here and add that to my configuration. And then the next thing I need to do is tell my Apostrophe instance where my pages should live. So I'm going to go to Apostrophe pages and edit that index.js configuration file. In this case, I have a basic page type of home. But what I want to do is add a URL for my new pages. So I'm going to use the park option. So what this is doing is giving my talks a slug of talks. I'm going to tell it to publish that. So it creates these pages when it starts up, when Apostrophe starts up. This park ID is just for database management. Title is just going to be what displays in the admin UI. And I'm going to tell it that it's my talks pages is what should live here. So I'm going to restart my server one more time, just to make sure that those changes get picked up. So the next thing we're going to do is actually display the fields. And to do that, out of the box, Apostrophe pages is going to come with a couple views. The index.html, which is currently blank. This is my index for all of those pieces. And the show.html, which is my detail page for an individual talk itself. So if you're not familiar with Nunjux, Nunjux comes with a couple things baked into it. Template inheritance, so we can extend another template. And this concept of blocks. So blocks are just editable, blocks are just areas of a template that I can choose to modify as I see fit. So in this case, for my index.html page, I'm going to extend the default Apostrophe templates layout. And this includes all of my JavaScript, CSS, and my main page layout. So I'm going to use that as my base. And the only thing that in that base that I'm going to overwrite is this block called main, which is the main part of my page. The next thing we're going to do is, as this is a pieces page, our data for that page is going to have an object on it, an array on it of pieces. And I'm just going to loop over those pieces for an individual talk and create a link to each of those individual talks. So I'm going to take this code and I'm going to put that in my index page. That's the wrong one. So this should give me that index. And if we now go to our talks URL, fingers crossed, I now have my talk. So a little bit confusing here. I already had a talk in here. I'll just change the name on it real quick so it doesn't look like they're duplicated. So I have now a link to my old talk and my new talk on my talks index. The next thing we're going to do is add the detail pages, and that's done through the show.html. Again, we're going to extend our apostrophe template's outer layout, and we're going to overwrite the block in that template called main. So the first thing that we can do is set, we're going to grab that first image. So we're going to use the nunjux apostrophe helper of images to grab the first image of our piece, and we're going to display it on the screen. We're then going to display the title of the talk itself and show the time of the individual piece. And then we're going to add our apostrophe area to show the content block that we added in our template. If all of that worked, I should now be able to go to detail screens. So this is my talk 2. My main image is now being shown. My title, which I'm getting in the way of, my time field, my general content, and the file that I've uploaded. So one thing you'll notice here that's a little bit different than before, when I start to hover over these items in the area that the content area that I created, I now have these additional options to do other things. So in the UI of the page itself, I can either move the piece up or down based on the way that I want this to display on the screen. So this is really ugly, but that is generally how you would display content out of the apostrophe admin. If you wanted to kind of quickly just add some CSS to make this not look as terrible, under apostrophe assets public CSS, inside of here is some basic less style sheets that you can start to edit to customize the look and feel of your site. You're not bound to doing things in less or using this directory structure like that. You could use your own kind of like builder or package Webpack or Grunt or Gulp if you really wanted to compile all your assets down and then include them in the template yourself. Okay, that was probably quite a bit. The next part that we're going to talk about is actually creating the Docker network to deploy our site to a server. So I'm going to jump back to my presentation, and we're going to go through Dockerizing Apostrophe. So going back to where we started, if you thought about the requirements of Apostrophe, we basically have these just two main pieces, Node.js and MongoDB. Those are the two things that we need for Apostrophe to run. So if you're going to start looking at how to Dockerize this, your first thought might just be to create a container that includes both of them. But that kind of goes against the primary ideas behind Docker of keeping containers small, lightweight, and standalone. It also probably is pretty hard to do this. Node and MongoDB probably have very different requirements. So trying to get them all into a single container is probably pretty hard. You're better off thinking about it like this. Each of your individual requirements are an individual container that will get to talk to each other using a Docker network. So how you might start to think about this, if you want to use the regular Docker command, there are ways to do this just using Docker, where you create the network. In this case, I'm just going to create a MyNet network. I'm going to connect an app to it, and then I'm going to connect a database to it. While this doesn't sound terrible, it does require a lot of running a lot of manual commands, and this could get tedious as your app starts to change or grow. So to kind of fix that, Docker Compose is something that also gets installed alongside Docker. What it's designed for is defining and running multi-container Docker applications. With Compose, you basically define a YAML file to configure your application services. And then with this single Docker Compose command, you can start and stop all the services from your configuration. This makes it a lot easier to start and stop aspects of your network. And to be honest, this is probably the way that I use Docker most. So what this looks like, this is a basic Docker Compose YAML file. The first thing up here is the Docker Compose version that you're going to use. In this case, we're going to use 3.7, or this one's using 3.7. The services configuration. In this case, I have two, my app and my database. These two names here are just kind of like placeholders. You can give your containers any kind of name you want. Docker does use those under the covers, but you can name the configuration of either of these containers anything. It doesn't have to be app or database. In my app configuration, I can use this build property to tell it the context. This is very similar to when we were doing like the Docker build command earlier in the presentation. This special key depends on, that's going to tell Docker Compose that there's a relationship between this app and database. But one thing to know that just because this depends on is within this container definition, that doesn't necessarily mean that Docker Compose is going to wait for the database to be ready before it tries to start the app. There are ways to get around that. We'll kind of go over it in a second, but just know that depends on doesn't actually mean wait on. Sorry. In our database configuration, instead of using a Docker file, this time we're just going to use a base image from we're going to use a base image from the Docker registry of MongoDB version 3.6. And we're going to tell it that we always want our database to restart because our app depends on it. After you've created your configuration, running Docker Compose up will start all your services. And if all goes well, you should see something printing out in your terminal. And then Docker Compose down will stop them all using this single command. Some common configuration references. These are kind of a lot of things that I just went over. For our purposes, we kind of need to use all of them in our configuration. The ones that I didn't go over are ports. That's very similar to what we were doing in the beginning, where we are exposing a port through the command line. You can also hard code it here in your Docker Compose configuration. For our purposes of Apostrophe, we are going to want to mount some volumes so that we can share some data between our host machine and the container itself. We went over depends on. Restart is the strategy that Docker will use if there's an issue with the container. And lastly, expose is what exposes the ports to the host machine. So in this last example, we're going to Dockerize our Apostrophe project. Again, there is a link to the repository. If you want to use the previous code, you could, but in 04, very similar to what we did before, I've added a my site Apostrophe project. This is a working version based on the previous one. And what we're going to do here is start to create our Docker image and our Docker Compose for our network. So we'll jump over to that. So the first thing that we're going to do is create the apostrophe image. Similarly to what we did before, we are going to use a Node application. Apostrophe is Node, so we'll use Node. Let me stop this. Go to 4. So all I'm doing is switching directories to the 04 example in my site. The first thing that I'm going to do is create the Docker file. So now I have a bare Docker file, and I'm going to start to configure my apostrophe image. So again, we're going to use node 12, and I'm going to set the working directory from where I'm going to start to copy my files. And I want that to be /app this time. The next thing that we're going to do is add our dependencies and install them. So again, we're in the root of our my site, and I want to copy my package.json file and install the dependencies within the container. Oh, sorry. And then we're going to run the npm command again to install them. So what we should have now, if we went to go run this image, is basically just a base node image with our dependencies installed. So what we want to do next is copy our apostrophe files into this container so that we can run our application. So quickly, again, looking at our apostrophe project, there's a couple things in here that we need. We don't actually need all of them. We do need this lib directory. This contains all the modules for our apostrophe site. We do want the scripts folder that has this waitforit.sh. I'll explain why in a second. We also want our views directory, and we want to make sure that we copy our app.js, which is our main apostrophe entry point. So again, we're going to copy the files in. And in this instance, I'm going to copy lib to app/lib and tell it to copy the directory there. I'm going to copy my waitforit script, just so I don't have a typo. I'm going to copy this line. And I'm going to put it in a scripts directory in my container under waitforit.sh. Lastly, we'll copy the views. And then we'll copy our app.js, which is the main entry point for apostrophe. And then lastly, we're going to want to start this container. So as I mentioned before, just because in our Docker Compose, we will tell our app that it depends on MongoDB, that doesn't actually mean that this container is going to wait for MongoDB to be ready before it starts. So in order to fix that, there is a script called waitforit.sh. There's some more information on the Docker site about why you might need to control startup and shutdown in Compose. But this is like a utility that they provide that will allow you to wait for Mongo to be available on port 27017 before it tries to run and start my app, my apostrophe app. So this gives that ability to do things kind of in order. The next thing we're going to do is to compose our network. So we have two pieces here. We're going to want to have our Apostrophe application and our database. So the first thing we're going to do is create the Docker compose file. So it's docker compose.yml. We're going to tell it what version of Docker Compose we're going to use. In this case, we're going to use 3. And then we're going to start to configure our services. In this case, I'm going to give my container a name just so I have a better idea of what it's going to look like when I go to inspect my running containers. And then we'll start to configure the Apostrophe container itself. So this is kind of similar to what we did in the Docker file, but we have some additional things that we can do here. We're going to tell it we always want Apostrophe to restart even if there's an error. This will keep our application running. We're going to give it the build context. This is similar to what we did in the CLI earlier in the talk. Because our Docker file lives in the root of our project, we can tell it that we want it to build from there, or use the Docker file in our root. Again, we're going to expose our ports. This is coming from our app.js configuration. By default, it's going to expose 3000. So we want to make sure that we can access that from the host. One thing different we're going to do here is because we want to be able to allow users to upload images, we don't want those to go away after the container is stopped. So the way that we can do that here is through a volume. And in this case, all of that information is going to be in a data directory that gets created when Apostrophe gets started. And that would be under data uploads. And I'm going to map that to a directory in my container of app public uploads. Another thing we're going to do here that we haven't done before is add an environment variable. This will get picked up by our Apostrophe application. And it's just going to tell Apostrophe where the MongoDB URI is. And then lastly, we're going to make sure that we know that this application depends on the MongoDB. So that should be our base configuration in our Docker Compose file for Apostrophe. The next thing we'll do is configure the Mongo container. In this case, we're just going to use the default Mongo image from the registry. We're also going to tell it to restart always. And for this container, we actually wanted to mount in our data directory. So again, this is going to be a directory that's created on Apostrophe starting. It's going to be this DB directory, and I'm going to map it to a directory in the container of data DB. And then lastly, we'll expose the default port of 27017. And then if all of this is configured correctly, we can use the docker compose up command to start all these containers at once. So you can see here the Mongo container has started. Apostrophe has seen that it started, but it's going to wait for Mongo to complete its process. And then finally, it's going to start Apostrophe. So now if I go to port 3000 again, we now see a containerized version of our application. So one thing here, we haven't added the default admin user yet. So if I try and log in, this should fail. So in order to do that, we'll actually have to go inside the container to add the admin user. So for doing that, we're going to use the exec command. So there's kind of two steps to that. First, we want to see everything that's running on our machine. If you go to the dashboard here, you will see that we have these two containers, but there's a piece of information that I need to get that I'm not sure I can get here. So I can do that through the docker ps commands. And that's going to print out everything I have running on my machine. See if I can make this a little bit easier to read. Sorry about the dog. So as you can see here, I have two containers running. One is my Apostrophe instance, and one is my MongoDB. The thing that's important here, sorry, hold on a second. The thing that's important here is this container ID. So I want to use that to make sure that I can get into this particular container to add my admin user. So I'm going to grab this ID, and then I'm going to use the exec command to SSH in there. I'm going to use the IT flag, which just makes it interactive. Tell it which container I want to SSH into, and then what command I want to run. So now I'm SSH'd into that container. Sorry, I'm going to try closing the door. Hopefully you don't hear a dog barking anymore. So now I'm SSH'd into this container in my app directory. And if I list everything that's here, oops, do it this way. I can now see all the files that I've copied into this container, including my app.js file, which is where I'm going to start, which is what I'm going to use to add my admin user. So I'm going to add node users, add admin. Again, this is using the apostrophe users add commands. And I'm going to add an admin user to the admin group. I'm prompted to add a password. And now if I try and log into my site again using that admin and password that I just created, I now can log in to my containerized networked apostrophe site. Yay. So I know that was a lot, and I know there's really only one other person in here, but if anyone has any other questions, I can take them now. If not, we also have a Discord group for Apostrophe. It's chat@ApostropheCMS.org. Feel free to join that. A lot of the core maintainers are pretty active in there. So if you have a question or start to use Apostrophe and need help, that's a good way to reach out to us. We're also pretty active on Stack Overflow. And lastly, thanks for spending 2 hours with me. To get some more information on Apostrophe CMS, you can visit our website. Also, go check us out on GitHub, Apostrophe CMS, and give us a star. That would be extremely helpful. Yeah, thanks.